Hello, welcome everyone. We are just going to take a couple of minutes before we get rolling proper, just to wait for everyone to join us, but we will start to see some people coming through and joining the webinar, so thank you. Good time to make yourself a cup of tea. If that's your cup of tea, go do that. Otherwise, in the chat function, feel free to let us know who you are and also where you're joining from. That can be a fun way to get to know one another while we just take one more minute. JP, you and I were chatting just before we went live. You are actually dialing in from Thailand today.
Yeah, that's right. So the time zones luckily work out quite well. I've been remote in various parts of the world over the last few years. So yeah, it'll be interesting to see where the participants are from as well. I assume they're from all over, at least Australia.
Yes, here we go. Annie, welcome from Sydney. Abdul from Sydney. Varun from Sydney. So a lot of Sydney-siders. Hopefully you guys are staying dry. And JP, you're doing the full digital nomad experience at the moment. When I spoke to you last, you're in Tasmania. And before that, where were you? Hong Kong before that?
Yeah, so I've been in Hong Kong last couple of years. So last few weeks have been pretty intense. And actually, since I've had COVID about a month ago, I've been recovering. Been testing negative for a couple of weeks now, but still coughing a little bit. So you'll have to excuse me if I'm coughing throughout the webinar. But yeah, just been traveling quite a bit.
We appreciate you joining us. Thank you for the COVID.
Thanks for having me.
Welcome. Arti from Brisbane, Vimani from Melbourne. Yep, Vimani, I'm with you. I've got my hot water bottle with me today. It's very, very cold down here. It's staying nice and warm. So thank you everyone for joining us. Look, I think we might get going. We'll still get a few people roll through as we go. But I think in the sake of time, let's get going. Hello, everybody. If I haven't met you before or you're new to Academy XI, I'm Olivia. I work in the team here and JP and I are going to be in conversation today all around data. But before we get going, Eve, welcome. From Sydney, Wes from Brisbane, so people from all around. This is fantastic. Thanks for joining. Eve also says she's interested in taking the data analytics course. So JP, we're going to talk about that a little bit later.
Absolutely, yeah. And I've been helping to mentor the course going forward, and recently got together with Academy XI to create the Data Analytics Elevate course. So it's been a really cool experience, which will, I guess, which will probably come up throughout the webinar.
I'd say so too.
Yeah.
Before we get started, I'd like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land on which we're gathering today and wherever you are joining us from. A few Zoom tips as well. We have a Q&A function right at the bottom. So I think we've already had a few questions come through. Let me just take a look. Yes, we have, which is really exciting because this session is really for you guys to ask the questions that you have on your minds. Harry has one there, Mohammed as well. Can you see those, JP?
Yeah, I can.
Fantastic. So we'll get back to that software and tools in a bit. The other thing you can do there is upvote those questions. So the ones that are on your mind, let's get them to the top of the list. Okay, let me have a look. Okay, so JP, I might throw over to you to introduce yourself, if you don't mind. Let us know a little bit about you, your background, and your journey to data.
Fantastic. Yeah, thanks, Liv. So my background at university is in engineering and in IP or intellectual property. But then I started working on a tech startup, which was all about extracting competitor information and market trends using scientific papers and patent data, which is quite information rich and dense. So in that process, I was immersed in data science, machine learning, and programming and all that good stuff. And more recently, though, I've kind of identified a need in a lot of organizations where, for many of them, if not most, the volume of data really outweighs the analysis tools and just general capability to do something meaningful with it. So I've kind of pivoted, and what we've been doing now is to help organizations make better use of data. So in order to help not only analyze it, but to really better consume the outputs and make better use of it going forward. So some of the stuff we do, what we have done, is things like help with the internal knowledge management systems by building databases and apps to access them and manage them over time. And things like business intelligence apps for analyzing consumer feedback or customer feedback on various products and groups, or even doing things like cool things like analyzing video feeds to extract information out of them. So body positioning and where joints are and how they move, things like that in real time, so you can provide real-time feedback on those video feeds. So that's been really cool. Been working with like clients small and large, from startups to really fairly big companies. And more recently, obviously, we've been working with you guys at Academy XI to create the Data Analytics Elevate course and mentoring the Data Analytics Elevate course, as well as the Transform course. And that's been a really rewarding experience, empowering people in that space as well.
Yeah, fantastic. And I remember when we first got to know one another, I had a look at your LinkedIn profile. You haven't always been in data. This is something you've been moving towards in the past couple of years, but do you want to take us back a little bit and sort of step us through your journey?
Yeah, I can. I think data science is an interesting field because it's a fairly new field. It kind of combines statistics, computer science, and it's a new discipline. So I've come from an engineering background. So I've got a fairly technical background. I used to code back at, like all my life, basically. And then I worked in, as a patent attorney for a few years as well. And that's where I kind of, the two worlds came together in terms of programming and the IP space. And I was working on that startup, right? So that was kind of all about leveraging the gigabytes or terabytes of patent data to do something with it and make it easier to extract intelligence and information out of that. And that's been kind of like the start of the formal, I suppose, move into the world of, as a developer and also as a data scientist. So that's been pretty unexpected, but it's also been really fun and rewarding because it's a new field. There's a lot of exciting developments going on, and I'm sure you've all heard all the discussions going on about AI. You've probably seen bots, chat bots, or whether it's like language generating bots, or even these days, you've probably seen pictures from things like DALL-E that generates images based on prompts you've given them.
Oh my God, I see that every day and it blows my mind.
Yeah. And there's a couple of things really cool about that, which is like learning to use these tools, which we'll talk about a bit later. But the creative prompts that people give those AI bots are really, really interesting because there's an art to kind of using them in terms of giving the prompts the right way, but also you want to make interesting images, right?
Yeah.
For whatever reason, engagement or otherwise. But so it's like a kind of part art, part science to using these tools as well. So yeah, that's quite interesting space.
What I think is really great about your story as well, and I think a lot of people on the call will resonate with this, you haven't always been a data scientist, now you're there. It's possible to transition and take those transferable skills. I mean, you've always been coding and interested in tech, but interesting to take those transferable skills and carve a career out for yourself in data. So I think a lot of people will relate to that. But we're also going to have a lot of people on this call, presumably like myself, who aren't too or overly familiar with data at all, and we're here to learn. So we're going to be speaking in fairly layman terms today. I think we should reframe and frame this up for ourselves. I guess the first question that comes to my mind is, why do all of us need to know or care about data at the moment?
Yeah, I think that's a really good question. And, over the last perhaps couple of decades, 10 years even, the word data has taken on this kind of like fairly mythical and intimidating quality. So let's just kind of talk about what it is, right? So I guess the more boring definition would be that data is just information that's been collected and quantified. That's really all it is, right? It's just any kind of information that's been written down essentially or recorded in some way. So in itself, it's not particularly meaningful or necessarily even important. And you can see why it might not necessarily be, you might not see what the hype or the fuss is about. But I think where we can all agree, though, is that being able to understand the world around us better and making higher quality decisions is really, really important and desirable. And data allows us to do exactly that. And the rise of things like machine learning and AI, in terms of there being bots that can, look at our radiology pictures and come up with a really accurate diagnosis that outperforms physicians and whatnot, is all enabled by data. Same thing as those bots like DALL-E and what have you. So it's really those enablers and the way to leverage data to better inform, to make better tools, and to make better decisions. I think those are the reasons to really care about data.
Yeah, fantastic. And look, I presume there'll be questions from an organisational perspective, coming down the pike at us as we keep going. And just a reminder to pop all your questions in the Q&A function, guys. We'll be looping back at about the midway point of this webinar. But in the enterprise side of our business, we are forever hearing about how can we make our people, or allow our people, or empower our people to make more data-driven decisions. And this is across whole organisations. So have you got any examples you can think of in, say, a corporate context where people could be using data just to do their everyday a little bit better?
Yeah. So I think, once you kind of define data as something that's been recorded, in terms of information, I think we'll see that a lot of times we already use a lot of data, right? This is not super in terms of a professional example, but we look at weather reports and weather forecasts all the time, right? So those models and forecasts are based on data, which is recorded existing history. And then the forecasts are created based on that, and we make decisions based on it. So that's every day that we use information like that and data. In professional capacities, if you're doing things like capacity planning, you'd be looking at things like your seasonal and annual data from your historical perspectives, and you'd have data about what your product release cycles might look like and how that affects your capacities, or how that has affected your capacities over time. So you'd make decisions based on that. If you're an R&D manager in a tech firm or a research firm, of course, you get scientific publications and patents and look at trends and see what your competitors are doing. And in probably one of the biggest change in the last 5-10 years has been doing things like A/B testing in a lot of domains, right? So that's websites, that's marketing, that's almost any domains, and that's extremely data driven in that we are able to do that and systematically analyze it to make better decisions on what people want, what kind of interfaces work better, and what kind of workflows work better for our customers.
Yeah, fantastic. And I think we're going to come back to that towards the end, but it would be amiss of us to have a data expert here and not actually talk just briefly about, what the data analysis process looks like for somebody who's a specialist, say a data scientist, a data analyst. Maybe let's just take a couple of minutes, and can you explain what that process is all about? And then we can drill down into other areas later on.
Yeah, sure. Yeah. So data science and data sort of analysis is such a big field. I won't pretend to kind of encapsulate all of that in one go, but I can talk a little bit about what data analysts do, which is, I guess, a little bit more defined in terms of using data to answer organizational questions and to come up with analysis that can be leveraged directly in an organizational perspective. So typically the process begins from defining the problem for the analyst, right? And that might be internal or external. So it means translating the business goals and objectives to specific data-driven analysis goals. And these are typically SMART goals, right? In the same way that we set SMART goals for any other things that we do, we set the SMART measurable, actionable, relevant, and timely goals, and move forward. And then, of course, the process of the analysis, I won't go through in detail because it's quite dry, to be honest. But it's all the steps of gathering data, cleaning data, exploring, and then finally performing the analysis to come up with insights from our data. And the last step is really the key one that as non-technical people or non-data professionals would really engage with a lot, as well as the first step, is really making use of the data and effecting change. And that might be communicating those outputs to the stakeholders to help them make better decisions, or it might be you consuming those outputs yourself to take action, or just to be better informed about the world around you. So that's kind of a really long way of saying that the data analytics process is all about answering questions about our world with data, so that by the end of it, we give ourselves a better chance of making better decisions than if we hadn't done that.
Yeah, fantastic. And it's always anchored to the real world. That's what I'm taking out of this. It's real world problems that we're using data to help us solve. When we sent this invitation out to everybody, we promised that we were going to be moving away from sort of data heavy spreadsheets and more towards actionable insights and giving people tips on how to do that. I understand, and from what we've talked about, there are 3 key pointers that you're going to be taking us through today when we're moving into more being data driven. Do you want to kick us off with the first pointer?
Sure. Why don't I share screens?
Nice.
That's okay. Fantastic. Cool. All right. Hopefully you can see that.
We've got you. Perfect.
Cool, cool, cool. So wanted to start by talking about developing your data intuition. So for a lot of non-data professionals, the key part of your data literacy skill that you should be focusing on is really the reading and comprehension part of data literacy. So what that means is being able to understand, internalize, and make use of the data-driven outputs, right? So as we've been talking about, the volume of data collected and data-driven outputs is really not going away, right? It's not going down. And many of you might already be dealing with these outputs. So you've probably heard about, really boring terms like confidence intervals, margins of error, and then, all the talk about what AI models can do. The good news is most of you will never need to calculate these statistics or develop any models yourself. What you will be doing, though, going forward is to be asked to consume these outputs and to integrate them to your work. So, and that's why developing your data intuition, which is a gut feel for what those data points tell you and how you can use them, is important, I think.
This is super interesting, JP. And I'm just going to pause here to say we had one of our attendees talk about this actually in a question she's posed. She says, "Hi, I'm a marketer wondering about instinct or gut feel versus being data-driven. Do both have a role to play in better decision-making? When do you need a balance of both?" And this is exactly what you're talking about, that balance at this stage.
Yeah. What people think of as gut feel or instinct is really interesting because that's basically your brain having internalized patterns that you've seen. So it's not really codified in terms of hard numbers, but there's quite often something to that. So how those insights and gut feels and intuitions get used might be in a process would be that you would form some hypothesis about your world and what's happening with your customers and what have you, using those gut feels. And then what you might do is to develop a data analytics process based on it to test the hypothesis, right? To see, is this actually happening? How likely is it that it's happening? What's this worth if we, make improvements based on it? And how do we leverage these insights? And quite often, of course, it turns out to be not true, right? Because we all have internal biases and we're wrong all the time. At least I'm wrong all the time. But yeah.
They're hard to steer away from, I agree. In our planning for this event, we were thinking, okay, let's think of a common sort of job role and how these pointers might relate to that person. So we thought about a customer service team manager. So how, in your opinion, would this kind of person develop data intuitions in their role?
Yeah, that's a really interesting point. And of course, it depends on every role. I won't pretend to be an expert on customer service team managers, so you'll have to forgive me if the example's not perfect. But as I was thinking about it, I think it would really help them in designing their workflow in terms of how to use data and how to engage with people, as we'll sort of talk more about later as well. So let's say our customer service team manager has some thoughts about how to improve their workflow, right, for the customers. So would they know what types of experiments to conduct to find out more about this? How many people they need to survey or get samples on, whatever, how much might it cost as a result? And then once you get the results back, what do you do with it? And would you know how to interpret it so that you can make sense of it? But then if you just had a general sense of what's possible, right? Once they understood what A/B testing is, how it worked, how those things are conducted, and who to talk to, it'll really help them get started. And it's the same thing with integrating things like chatbots, which is, I think, used a fair bit in the world of customer service, right? We kind of see that a lot on websites, and quite often you see the box pop up and it's not a real human. It just says that you're talking to a chatbot. Chatbots aren't, they're cool. It's not magic. They can't do everything, right? So if you understand the kind of things they can do really well, which is things like question and answer and kind of retrieving certain parts of information, they'll be able to then look at their data and say, well, how much of our work for the representatives is that, right? So, and then how much would introducing chatbots help to our workflow? How much would it cost? And you can do that cost benefit analysis much, much more easily. Rather than just, if you didn't understand what chatbots did, what they couldn't do, it'll be really hard to make that comparison and think about whether it's worth integrating tools like that to your work.
Yeah, fantastic. And we are going to thread this example through as we keep going through these pointers, just to, again, anchor this to the real world. But I think let's move on to the second one, because this for me is always a really fascinating area. I think we've all been privy to some pretty dodgy, confusing data visualizations in our time. So dealing with data visually, this is pointer number 2.
Yeah, thanks. I do a lot of work in data visualizations just because it's, I think, an essential tool for those who work with data kind of day in, day out, but also for consumers of data. So the thing is that we simply can consume a lot more information and faster when it's visually encoded. So, if you just had a table like that and you're trying to make sense of any of that and what's the pattern, and actually there's thousands of rows in that. But if you actually see a graph like that, you can see patterns on that pretty clearly, right? So that's one thing, one benefit about data visualization. So even if you're just like a casual user of data, doing something like this isn't very hard, and it's a skill that you can learn easily. Now, another good thing about visualization is that unusual patterns like this reveal themselves really quickly. Again, this is amongst thousands of data points, and this is a data looking at domestic gross and foreign gross of movies, and this is from one of the data analytics courses. So if you've seen it, it'll probably look familiar. So these points kind of indicate that all these movies made almost $500 million or more, but made $0 overseas. So if you actually dig into that, it turns out that there's an error in the units for the foreign gross. So stuff like that reveals themselves really, really quickly, which is another benefit of using data visualization. And this is another interesting one. So this is a whole bunch of different data sets, and each one of them, although they visually look very different to us, they'll actually all have the same statistical summaries. So this is an insight that you won't see unless you just quickly plot them as a graph and see what's going on. And of course, there are these individual patterns. And this dinosaur actually has the same statistical pattern as well. And this was actually a famous example because a university professor set this as an exam and asked the students to describe what they were seeing in the data. And if you hadn't plotted it, you didn't see that the professor was trolling them with this dinosaur picture. And a lot of them actually hadn't. So, obviously you're not always going to see dinosaurs or cute animals in your data sets. But without using visualizations, you actually will miss a lot that you can pick up really, really easily. And a couple of tips on using, I guess, data visualizations for me is that less is more. So this is a fairly infamous chart. So don't create charts like this is the main message of this slide. It's quite an infamous chart because there's a lot going on, and it's they're certainly striking with these bananas in the background and 3D bar charts and whatever, but you really can't make heads or tails of what it is that you're trying to tell the audience. So in quite a lot of the cases, less is more. So instead of using charts like this on the left, where you got a bunch of things going on with, 5, 10 different categories and colors, something like on what's on the right might be fairly simple with just 2 colors, but using these line thicknesses and just drawing the reader's attention makes your message clear and much faster. And these are some of the tools that people can use to draw attention to certain parts of your visualization, and that can really help what people take away from the message or from the visualizations and your presentations.
Yeah, fantastic. And I guess at the end of the day, this is really about clear communication and setting yourself up, I guess, with some simple tools to help you do that, which links us to a question from Harry, who says, what software tools can one learn to be an expert in data visualization? Any you'd recommend, JP, off the bat?
Yeah, there's a few depending on your workflow and how you use data visualization. Some of the more popular ones are tools like Tableau, Power BI if using desktop software. And then online, there's tools like Data Wrapper or what's called Flourish. So these are like online tools that you can log onto a website and use. Someone like me, because obviously a lot of my work is in the programming space, I'll use programming libraries like Plotly or Bokeh, or even something called D3. So it's really horses for courses in terms of what you're doing and what you're trying to present. In a lot of cases, if you're just creating charts, simple charts for presentation purposes, and it's not your main work, something like even Excel is really good enough because it's not really about creating the most fancy chart and the most complex chart, but it's about really communicating your message through, whatever means necessary.
Yeah, fantastic. And let's loop back to that customer service team manager. How would you envisage they use visualizations to communicate data clearly?
Yeah, so there's two sides of that, right? So as consumers of data visualizations, it's important that they be able to communicate with the stakeholders, or sorry, the service providers who might be creating these visualizations, so you understand what it is that they're telling them. Quite often though, if depending on where you're at in an organization or what your role is, you quite often will be in the role where you have to communicate your findings from your studies to, stakeholders higher up. And in that case, quite often that means selecting some charts or even creating some charts yourself to communicate your message and key takeaways to your stakeholders. So in that case, you'd want to be able to make at least some charts. And it's not probably as intimidating as it feels for a lot of people to learn how to create these charts. And as I mentioned, those online tools like Data Wrapper or Flourish that I really like are very easy to use. It's just, if you can learn how to use Canva, you can probably use a lot of these tools.
That intuitive, huh?
Yeah, it's pretty good. So I would recommend that, people check those out. And as we'll talk about these tools later, and it's really empowering, I think, which probably leads us well to our next point.
Go for it, JP. Yep.
Yeah,
cool. Empower yourself with tools.
Fantastic. Oh, that's strange. Cool. So it's really about empowering, yourself and as well as others in the organizations with tools, right? So there was this stat that I read, which was mind-blowing. And it said that when people are faced with data-related tasks, about half the people would either avoid the task or not use the data provided at all. So that's quite interesting. And on top of that, about 3/4 of the same respondents said that those tasks made them unhappy or overwhelmed. And that's a really striking stat for me, because that means for most of this, or for half of those people, they're not using the data. So they're not any better off than they would have been if they hadn't been provided with the data. But now they've been left kind of disenfranchised or unhappy and disempowered by, sort of feeling like they're not capable of doing this. So data is actually, for those people, made their lives and work worse than if they hadn't had that in the first place. So one of the key recommendations here is to kind of really empower yourself with a tool that can add value to your work. And it doesn't have to be anything super fancy like a programming language. And, it can be something fairly basic, like just learning how to use a couple of formulas in Excel or load up data in Excel or Google Sheets. So it might be something like, Tableau, or even, those online tools like drawing charts in Canva or Data Wrapper, as I mentioned. And that'll be really quite empowering. And it depends on what your work is and what your relationship with data is. But I think it can be a kind of transformative experience.
Yeah, this is great. And I think we are probably nearly getting ready to open up for Q&A. We've had quite a few questions come through already, but this is now a formal prompt. If you guys have questions, please get them in so we can open it up to JP for the next half hour. But I might kick this off. I guess there's a general question up top here from Artie, which is an interesting one. And it's about the difference in job profile between data scientist and data analyst. If there is a difference, what should a data scientist do in the data analytics field? Do you want to unpack this one a bit for us, JP?
Yeah, so I've been struggling. So one of the things that we wanted to do at the start of our data analytics course was to disambiguate between these two terms, between data analyst and data scientist. And I think the truth of the matter is that they are fairly nebulous terms. But I'll try and do what I can in terms of the best of my understanding. Yeah. Data science is generally a broader term than a data analyst. So, we talked about the process of data analysis, right, in terms of problem definition, all the way out between data cleaning, data munging and analysis, all the way to delivery of data communications. Data science tends to be a little bit broader, And a lot of what data scientists do is things like develop models, like, if you're talking about people who develop state-of-the-art models in image recognition. So I'm getting fairly technical. So like, if you see those bots or websites online where you put in a picture and it tells you what it is, or if you look at, if you're driving a Tesla and it's able to drive around and figure out if they're driving on a road or if they're about to run into another car or follow lanes and stuff. So those are all driven by AI models developed by data scientists. So that's probably a fairly that's probably how I understand data science and data analysis.
Mm.
And in terms of what should a data scientist do to get into data analyst field, I think some of the skill sets are slightly different. So data analysts tend to work with things like SQL a little bit more. They're dealing with kind of more predefined roles and analysis pipelines because they're more often in a business role, answering defined business questions with these tools. Whereas data scientists' roles are, things like building models. So it tends to be a little bit different from that sense.
Yeah, thank you, JP. I think I'm going to step in here and ask something that we come across a lot in our enterprise side of the business. So when we work with organisations and government, we often hear from L&D managers and they say, okay, look, our executive has said our people need to be more data literate and make more data-driven decisions across the board. Where do we even start? Because our people have varying levels of competency already. How do we even begin on this journey? Do you want to weigh in on that?
I think there's a couple of things that can help. Obviously, one thing is just kind of like to reduce that intimidation factor in dealing with data. And I think a lot of that is going to be just training and continued development for those people and supporting them throughout. And in terms of how to, figure out where they're at in terms of their comfort with data and their abilities, I think would be a good idea to have conversations with people and, obviously in a comfortable environment. And to have conversations about how comfortable are you dealing with these tools, which we think would be useful in your task or in your day-to-day tasks. And then you can ask them questions like, how comfortable are you with Excel? How comfortable are you with formulas? How comfortable are you with pivot tables, VLOOKUP formulas, and so on and so forth. And moving forward, it might be, if you're dealing with databases all the time, how much do you use SQL, and things like that. Obviously, it's probably quite intimidating to be formally assessed in something, but I think a lot of training would be a really good way forward for many organizations, and it can be collaborative processes too if you put them in groups and work on kind of relevant business problems together. So I think people see a lot of benefits from doing that.
Absolutely. And I think I'd just add in there as well, sometimes if you run, an initial training, say a workshop, you actually get insight into where those skill gaps are, and then you can plan for future capability uplift off the back of that initial assessment. So I think that's terrific advice. I'm seeing two questions here that are quite similar, so I'll pose them to you at the same time. Artie asks about, excuse me, whether data scientists need to have knowledge of statistics. And then Amit asks about what level of IT knowledge do you need to become a data analyst? So maybe we can tackle these in the same question.
Okay. I'll try and talk about the IT one first.
Sure.
So I guess by nature, if you're dealing with data science, data analytics types of fields, it is undoubtedly going to be computer heavy. So levels of computer literacy is really helpful. So, but I guess if the question is, can someone without an IT background join the data world? I think the answer is yes. Like none of us are born with these skills, right? These aren't innate, skills that are encoded into our genes or anything. So for sure, it is something that we can learn. Of course, it might make it slightly more difficult at the start if you're trying to pick up data skills as well as how to use certain computing skills like how to use shells and so on and so forth. But it's certainly possible. And I've seen people do it in the data transform courses. A lot of the courses in our cohort that I'm mentoring come from a non-technical background. I would say actually most of them come from non-technical background, and a lot of them pick it up really well. And they do fully admit that it is not easy, but it's something that they pick up and they do really well. So that's great to see. In terms of statistics, so there's two parts to this question I can see. So I'll try to answer the first part about the knowledge of statistics. Depending on what you do in data science. So again, if you're building models and using machine learning to do things like regression models, which is, when you predict things like numbers. So when you predict things like housing prices based on where it is, or how big the house is, blah, blah, blah. Or if you're, using models in any level, you want a fairly good intuition of statistics and maths. But if you actually if you actually work on some of these fields, what you'll see that what's required isn't a university graduate level of statistics or algebra or calculus. What you do need is basically like low level understanding of some statistics and some algebra, and that's kind of all you need. If you, of course, are doing some role that is fairly statistics heavy, and that might be in the fields of experiments, where you are, required to do things like, does this experiment tell us with a certain degree of confidence that this drug is going to work or something like that. Those fields are, of course, more statistics heavy and critical. So it really depends. And as to the second question about certification in statistics, this is a good chance to plug some of our courses because the Data Analytics Transform course covers a fair bit of stats. As far as other certifications in statistics, I
think we might have some patchy.
Probably am not knowledgeable enough to recommend a particular one or anything like that.
We've still got you. It's just a little bit patchy, but that's quite okay.
So,
well, I think we got most of you there.
Okay, cool.
While it just stabilizes, I might just sort of pull this back to a macro perspective as well and say, look, all around the world, particularly in Australia, though, we're facing a digital skills gap that we've got to close here. So there is going to be a need for people who aren't particularly comfortable with stats, who aren't particularly comfortable with IT yet, to make that jump and go across into these fields. In terms of what that actually looks like, well, we're going to need 79% more newly skilled and reskilled tech workers by 2025. So we've got a very sort of tangible problem we're hoping to solve here, and Academy XI, I guess, plays a role in terms of helping people to make those jumps. So just to pull it back, we're going to need people to do this. So we welcome you to come learn with us. Let's go back to a few more questions. I guess Tammy's question relates nicely. Is it worth doing a master's degree in this field, or would the Elevate course or Transform course offered be enough to become a data analyst or data scientist?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I guess don't feel particularly well placed enough to say whether a master's is worth doing, because I guess that's a fairly personal type question. The Elevate course is designed for primarily non-data professionals trying to upskill and sort of become more familiar in dealing with data, and to empower them, as we mentioned, and to give them a flavor of what a professional data analyst might do. So that's why we have optional modules on things like using Python, which we encourage people to look at, but it's not part of the assessment or anything like that. And we do the same thing with giving them a flavor of things like machine learning and to show them what they can do. The Data Analytics Transform course is meant for exactly that, for people who's trying to get into the field of data analytics. So I guess that's the intent of it, and we do it's fairly intensive course. I think it's designed to be around 15, 20 hours a week, for 14 weeks part-time. So, that is what it's intended for, and it covers the gamut from learning how to use Python and using statistics, and ending up with being able to build regression models as the capstone project, where you can pick a subject of your choice or topic of your choice, build a regression model out of it, and to be able to really complete that loop, I suppose, from problem definition stage to deriving some insights and communicating it out to external stakeholders.
Yeah, fantastic. Thanks for that, JP. I'm just having a look through here. Jeff Goddard has posted a question. He says, hi there. If you don't have a data analyst in the business, it's hard to get the data you want extracted. Any tips on how to implement a data analyst into an organization?
I think it goes twofold. I think it's really important for data analysts to understand what the business objectives are, what their priorities are, and how they work. Because I think and conversely, it's important for the organization to understand what data can tell you and what the data analyst can do for you and what they can't do. So understanding the limitations. So, and that's because it's really important for data analysts at the problem definition stage to clearly understand the objectives as far as what the business objective is, so they can translate that into actionable goals that they can perform. And it's if that doesn't happen necessarily well, what actually happens is, well, the business stakeholders would ask or provide a brief, and that necessarily doesn't get translated in to data analyst understanding. They go off and do the work, get some results back, and it turns out that it doesn't necessarily answer the question that they were looking to answer, or it's not particularly actionable. And from the data analyst perspective, quite often the complaint I hear is, well, they asked me to do this thing that's not actually possible. So now I have to, manage their expectations about what is actually possible with data, as well as to try and answer this question in some way. So if they have the understanding of what the limitations of data and analysis, they can obviously integrate the data analyst or the team better into the organization and make better use of that resource.
Fantastic. And I think perhaps another solution, Jeff, might be to upskill the people you've got in sort of basic data literacy so they can start to extract some of this data where they see it in their everyday jobs as well. But great question. Thank you. We've got a few more minutes, probably 10 more minutes for questions. So keep popping them in. I'm going to pose one from Andrew, who is asking, do you have a structure when communicating the insights you've garnered from data to stakeholders? So I guess this is a process for communicating to others.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's a really good question. And I think of data communication as similar to a part of rhetoric. So when you're trying to, convince someone or change their minds on something, and the data should really be designed on backing that up. So a good place to start would be to think about what your goal was when you started the data analysis and kind of anchoring everything back to that. And in terms of the structure or the methodology, it doesn't have to be something complex. So, you might actually see some beautiful data visualization online or on Twitter. I follow a lot of these people, so I see a lot of that. But then you kind of look at it, and even for me, who's quite used to them, I kind of go, oh, that's really pretty. No idea what that says, but it's really pretty. And so sometimes just a table with like 3 numbers might be better than a very complex, beautiful data visualization because it tells a clearer message. So that's my way of saying that, whatever does the job is good, or is what you want. And, I know I said less is more in terms of visualizations, but it fits for the right audience. You can actually do more complex things. And for certain clients of mine, I might, I've built some dashboard apps that look at data, it's connected to their data pipeline. But what that allows the audience to do is to dig further into the data themselves. So those types of outputs tend to be a little bit more complex, but because they have the expertise in their domain and because they are a little bit more data savvy, and that goes back to your point about empowering them with data literacy and so on, they're able to dig into the data yourself. So they won't be, performing the analysis and cleaning the data and so on and so forth and building those models, but they can look into it and answer their own questions as they go.
Yeah, fantastic. I think that's great. It's almost like suss the audience and then pitch it to them accordingly.
100%.
Read the room. Yeah, fantastic. I'm going to pose a question here from Eve Lam. It's quite a specific one. She is a junior marketer and hoping to be able to make use of marketing data to optimize marketing decisions and campaigns. However, I don't come from a technical background, so I wonder which course I should take in terms of Elevate versus Transform. Any thoughts?
Okay. Yeah, I think for me, the Elevate course would be preferable in your use case, Eve. So it is designed, as we mentioned, around non-data professionals looking to upskill and really understand more about the world of data and data analytics and answering questions using data. So that's my 2 cents on that. Of course, if you're looking to challenge yourself, I wouldn't discourage you from taking the Transform course. But that would be my recommendation, is the Elevate course.
Yeah, nice. And I just want to flag there, Eve, thank you so much. I can see that you did our digital marketing course, Elevate, and now looking to upskill yourself potentially in data analytics. So really nice pathway that you're creating there for yourself.
I'll just add one more thing, sorry. Sure. So I'll just pipe in. In the Transform course, we do cover a little bit more of things like statistics and hypothesis testing and A/B testing and how to analyze results of that more clearly. So I guess that might be, if you're specifically interested in those areas, you might look into the Transform course. But yeah, it is significantly more challenging because it is fairly programming heavy. But I was just wanted to mention that about A/B testing and analyzing those results, since you mentioned you're in marketing decisions and campaigns.
Yeah, and I think there's a good question here from Annie Liu that also ties in. She's got a background in tech sales, but seems to be quite curious in terms of data and how she can be using data a little bit more. I guess her last question here is, I'm thinking of reaching out to their marketing team in-house or other departments to see where I can add value. And she asks any tips on what tools she can leverage to work on during her own time. So perhaps not a course formally, but something a bit lighter.
That's a really good question. So one thing that a lot of people do, and she mentioned looking for new opportunities and whatnot. A lot of things that people do is try and build their online portfolio in data science analysis. And there's a lot of data out there that's good, really, really high quality and publicly available. So what people do is to source some of those data in whatever domain you're interested in, and build a portfolio of analysis and publicly and build your publicly available profile. Now, you can do a similar thing with your organizational data probably too, depending on what is available to you given your role and how accessible that data is. So what I might look at is to say, well, it's always useful to solve a problem that the organization has. And quite often what they'll have is things like, there's a lot of data in this field and they've collected it for whatever reason, and they probably haven't had time to do anything with it. And so they can probably give you a background on what they were thinking when they collected this data and why they haven't actually done anything with it. And it might be something as simple as they collected all this data, but it's quite messy. So they need someone to go through that and clean it. And that's a really valuable process. There's a running joke that people think data science is extremely glamorous and you're building these AI bots and whatever. Actually, what you're doing is just cleaning data and getting rid of typos and what that like 90% of the time. And that's more true than people actually think. So, I would say talk to people who has, data in your organization, and talk to them about the background as to why, and talk to them about like what their needs are. And you can probably help them to, address some of that. And it's a good way to build your and to network as well with the parts of the business.
Yeah, great. I think we've probably got time for 2 more questions here. So I'm going to come back to Mohammed's question, which is quite specific, but ask one that I hear quite a lot of. And it's around, how do people in an organization best work with specific data teams? So there are often teams of specialists who are excellent at what they do, but how can others in the business really tap into that resource in an effective way?
Again, I think it's about engagement and, as you mentioned, about data literacy. So I think quite often what you'll see in organizations is that they're perhaps a little bit too siloed in terms of, I know that we have a data team somewhere in the building. Yeah. Never seen them before. They seem like they're in front of the computer all the time. Who knows what they do? So really, again, helping them, engaging with them, talking to them about what they do. And then that also helps them understand what you do and what your needs are as well. And I think I've dealt with, spoken to people who are doing things like rolling out tools like Tableau in the organization. And they said actually getting to engage throughout the organization because they were rolling out these tools helped them to, speak to different parts of the organization that they otherwise wouldn't have, got to understand them better and so on. So I think it's really about engagement and of course, bring them up to speed as to what they can and can't do with data literacy, and so they can have a better mutual understanding.
Yeah, nice. I like this, and always anchoring it back to organizational problems that need to be solved, which is what people, outside of data teams understand and know, and that's where the collaboration benefit, I think, lies.
Yeah.
Great. One last question we've got time for here from Mohammed, quite specific, but he asks, would it be a good place to start BI from the start or follow it through Excel, SQL, and then BI?
I guess, Mohammed, I'm not 100% sure whether you might be referring to business intelligence in general, or you might be talking about like a specific tool like Power BI. Something like Power BI is good. It's a desktop tool so that you can, so tools like Power BI and Tableau, I'll go back a step, are designed to make generating business intelligence and dashboards easier, right? And they've grown over time, so they can actually connect to data sources as well as to generate charts, right? So they can do a little bit of data cleaning, a little bit of data manipulation, but it's mostly a data visualization tool. So I would say it depends on how clean your data is. So if you're working with processed data from an external service provider or your internal data team that's dealt with your data sets and it's clean and it's just ready to be looked at, and all you're doing is slicing and dicing that, you can just go to your BI tool and go through that. Otherwise, I would say, yeah, as you mentioned, whether you use Excel or Python or R, whatever, to process it. Or of course, you'd get data from SQL. And then you would use some sort of a BI tool to plot and review that.
Yeah.
I hope that answers the question. Sorry if I misunderstood that.
No, that's okay. It can be tricky as well when we're answering, texted in questions. But thank you so much, everybody, for your questions. They were terrific, and we had a pretty broad spectrum there. As promised, we are going to loop back to your involvement in our Data Analytics Elevate and Transform courses as well, JP. Before we do that, though, I'd like to thank you personally for carving out the time whilst you're in Thailand on the way to the UK to be part of this today, and the preparation that was involved. It's been a fantastic session, so thank you for making yourself available. I think it'd be great to ask you, what was it like creating this course with us, and what were some of the major considerations that you kept in mind when building the Elevate course?
Cool. Yeah, thanks very much. First of all, it's been a pleasure, and it's been really great to engage with different people and answer these questions, and really cool to see that people are interested in data analytics and data in general. So with the Data Analytics Elevate course, what we were looking to do is to build an accessible course for non-data professionals. That was kind of like one of the concepts that I had in the back of my head. And to contrast with a lot of different courses, which might be quite challenging and has an extremely steep learning curve. And perhaps also at the end of the day, not that practical, because many of us might be data, as I mentioned, kind of data adjacent, and you're not necessarily performing analyses yourself in greater depth, or in terms of creating models and calculating things like that. So that was kind of like the idea behind that. And what we really focused on was giving people better ideas about why these tools and skills are important, giving them good data intuitions, as we mentioned, and taking them through the whole stage between the problem definition and through communicating outputs to the stakeholders, or just consuming those outputs yourself, and empowering people so that they can not only perform those tasks if as required, but also to better engage with specialists and professional data scientists or data analysts as they go forward as well. So it gives them a good exposure to the whole gamut and spectrum of skills, as well as to empower them to engage professionals if need be.
Yeah, amazing. And you mentioned earlier that you're the mentor for our Transform course happening at the moment. Do you want to kind of give us an indication of who's in that course, what kinds of backgrounds they've come from, or a couple of examples of who's going on this journey with you?
Yes, it's been really gratifying to see how much people pick up in a fairly intense short period of time. They come from all sorts of backgrounds, and mostly non-technical. So I would say that only a small proportion of them, because at the start I was kind of curious and asked people, hey, how many of you have any kind of coding background? The first few weeks are fairly intensive in terms of coding. I think Annie mentioned she was in the course, so she'd probably relate to that for sure. And yeah, it was a very small percentage, I think maybe about 20%. They come from a very diverse background. They're like, ethnically diverse, and in terms of age as well, fairly diverse. Yeah. So yeah, that's really cool. And in terms of how much they picked up in the course, we just finished doing our first phase 1 project. So I've been able to see people's outputs. And what I've been consistently telling people is like, hey, look how far you've come in just a few weeks, because they did this at the end of week 5. In just a few weeks, where you weren't able to code really at all, to be able to, load up all this data, analyze it, clean it, analyze it, present the information back to, a hypothetical stakeholder, and, and upload all this information to your part of basically what's going to start to form part of their professional portfolio. So that's been really cool to see and rewarding internally for me personally as well.
Yeah, amazing. It just sounds like a fantastic course. And I'll be really interested to see how people go when they finish up their time with you and, you know, make their way into seeking jobs and finding employment, which is always super exciting as well. We are going to wrap it there, I think. Thank you, JP, again, for your time and for answering all these questions and being so involved. Before we wrap up, though, I just want to say a recording of this session is going to be sent to everybody, so look out for that in your inbox in the next day or so. And we're also going to be sending a survey out as well in the coming days. These surveys are quick, like less than a minute, and they always help steer us in terms of what you're looking for in terms of future events. So we would love for you to complete that and just spend that minute doing that. I guess a plug here for us, reach out to Academy XI if you're interested in learning more about data training for your teams and organisations. We're especially doing a lot in the data space at the moment with corporates and government, probably our fastest growing sort of disciplinary vertical. So really interesting to see that come along. And then if you're an individual looking to upskill in data, check out our courses online or reach out to one of our course advisors. They'd be happy to help you too. We also have your details, JP, your email address and website, which we're going to share in the chat now. So feel free to get in touch with JP
Perfect.
if you need his help and expertise with anything. But I think beyond that, thanks again, everybody, for spending your lunchtime with us. I hope we got to answer your questions and hope to see you all again soon. Thanks so much.
Fantastic. Yeah, thanks everyone. Thanks, Liv, for having me. It was a lot of fun.
Great. Thanks, JP. See you, everyone. Have a great day.
Cheers. Bye-bye.